I arrived at Ravenmoor on the coldest evening of November, carrying everything I owned in a single leather trunk and a heart full of quiet desperation. I did not know then that the crumbling estate before me held secrets worth more than all the jewels in London, nor that the man who owned it would one day look at me as though I had shattered his entire world. My name is Rosalind Ashcroft, and I was 23 years old when I stepped out of that hired carriage onto the gravel drive of the Duke of Ravenmoor's ancestral home. The wind cut through my wool cloak like a blade, and the grey sky pressed down upon the land as though the heavens themselves wished to crush this forgotten corner of England. I stood there for a long moment, staring up at the house. It was not beautiful in the way that great houses are meant to be beautiful. There was no warmth in its tall windows, no welcome in its heavy stone facade. Ivy climbed the eastern wall like a slow disease, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the mournful cry of birds circling over water. I had been warned about this place. The agency in London had spoken carefully when they offered me the position, their words measured in that particular way that suggested more than they were willing to say. The Duke of Ravenmoor requires a governess for his young ward, they had told me. He is a private man, the estate is remote. The previous governess left after only 3 months. When I asked why she had departed so quickly, the woman behind the desk had simply looked at me with something like pity and said, "Some houses are not suited to everyone." But I had no choice. My father, a country pastor beloved by his small congregation, had died the previous spring, leaving behind nothing but debts, and a daughter with no marriage prospects and no inheritance. I had spent the summer selling what little we owned, paying what creditors I could, and watching the life I had known dissolve like morning mist. By autumn, I had exactly 2 options remaining: accept a position as a governess in some distant household, or throw myself upon the mercy of distant relatives who had made it clear they had no room for a penniless cousin. Pride, that stubborn companion of the desperate, had made the choice for me. The front door opened before I could reach for the bell, and a woman emerged onto the steps. She was perhaps 50 years of age, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been handsome once, before time and duty had drawn tight lines around her mouth. She wore the black dress of a housekeeper, and her eyes moved over me with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to measuring the worth of others. "You must be Miss Ashcroft," she said, and her voice carried neither warmth nor coldness, only a careful neutrality that I would come to recognize as the currency of this household. "I am Mrs. Pemberton. I oversee the domestic affairs of Ravenmoor. Come inside. The Duke does not like to be kept waiting." I followed her through the entrance hall, my boots echoing against marble floors that had seen better days. The interior of the house matched its exterior, grand in scale but weary in spirit, as though the very walls had grown tired of standing. Portraits lined the corridors, generations of Hatherleys staring down with expressions of aristocratic disapproval. I felt their painted eyes upon me as I walked, and I wondered how many other young women had passed beneath their gaze, hopeful and afraid, only to flee within months. Mrs. Pemberton led me to a door at the end of a long hallway and knocked twice. A voice from within, low and clipped, bid us enter. The study was dark despite the hour, heavy curtains drawn against the fading afternoon light. A fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across walls lined with books and maps. And there, behind a massive oak desk cluttered with papers, sat the man who would change the course of my existence. Lord Edmund Hatherley, the 7th Duke of Ravenmoor, did not rise when I entered. He did not smile. He barely looked up from the document before him, his pen continuing to scratch across the page as though my presence were an interruption scarcely worth acknowledging. I stood in silence, my hands clasped before me, and studied him in the firelight. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair that fell in careless waves across a high forehead. His face was striking rather than handsome, all sharp angles and deep-set eyes that, when they finally lifted to meet mine, held the color of winter storms. There was a severity to his features that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens, and something else beneath that severity, something that looked almost like pain. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like a verdict. "You are the new governess." It was not a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes, Your Grace, I am grateful for the opportunity to serve in your household." He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving over me with the same assessing quality I had seen in Mrs. Pemberton, though sharper, more penetrating. I had the uncomfortable sensation of being catalogued and found unremarkable. "Your references speak well of your education," he said. "Latin, French, mathematics, natural philosophy. Unusual accomplishments for a pastor's daughter. My father believed that knowledge was a gift to be shared with all of God's children, regardless of their station or sex." I kept my voice steady, though my heart beat hard against my ribs. He taught me himself, from the time I was old enough to hold a book. Something flickered in the Duke's eyes, too quick for me to name. "And yet here you are," he said, "seeking employment in a house that most would consider beneath your abilities. I am curious, Miss Ashcroft. What brings a woman of education and apparent refinement to the edge of nowhere?" The question was deliberately unkind, designed to unsettle me. I recognized the tactic. I had encountered men like him before, men who wielded their power like a weapon and expected others to cower beneath its weight. But I had lost too much already to be frightened by mere words. "Circumstance, Your Grace," I replied. "The same force that shapes all our lives, whether we are born in cottages or castles." For a long moment, he simply looked at me. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Very well, Miss Ashcroft. Mrs. Pemberton will show you to your quarters and introduce you to your charge. Her name is Clara. She is 7 years old. She is my ward, the daughter of my late cousin, and she has not spoken a single word since she came to live at Ravenmoor 6 months ago. The doctors say there is nothing wrong with her voice. The problem, they tell me, is in her heart." He returned his attention to his papers then, dismissing me as completely as if I had ceased to exist. Mrs. Pemberton touched my elbow, guiding me toward the door, but I hesitated on the threshold. "Your Grace," I said, and he looked up with evident impatience. "What happened to her? To Clara?" The question hung in the air between us, and I watched something close behind his eyes like a door being shut. "That, Miss Ashcroft, is not your concern. Your concern is teaching her to read and write and conduct herself as befitting a young lady of her station. Do not trouble yourself with matters beyond your purview." The dismissal was absolute. I inclined my head and followed Mrs. Pemberton out of the study, but as the door closed behind me, I could not shake the feeling that I had just glimpsed something the Duke had not intended me to see. Beneath that cold exterior, beneath the sharp words and the aristocratic indifference, there was a wound that had never healed. My quarters were in the east wing, a modest room with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a window that overlooked the back of the estate. Mrs. Pemberton pointed out the necessities, the location of the servants' hall, the hours for meals, the areas of the house that were open to me and those that were not. She spoke with efficiency and without warmth, and I understood that friendship was not something offered freely in this household. Before she left, I asked her about the view from my window. The land stretched out behind the house in a patchwork of fields and woods, but beyond them, where the ground seemed to dip and darken, lay something else entirely. A vast expanse of waterlogged earth, dotted with skeletal trees and shrouded in a low mist that clung to the surface like a living thing. "That is the marsh," Mrs. Pemberton said, and her voice carried a note of distaste. "It marks the northern boundary of the estate, or it did, until His Grace sold it last year." "Sold it?" I repeated, surprised. "To whom?" "A speculator from the south. He paid £10 for the lot, and most thought His Grace had gotten the better end of the bargain. Nothing grows there. Nothing lives there. It is useless land, fit only for fog and fever." The man who bought it came once to survey his purchase and never returned. I imagine he realized soon enough that he had bought nothing but mud and regret. I looked out at the marsh as she spoke, watching the mist curl and shift in the dying light. There was something almost beautiful about it, I thought, in a desolate, forgotten way. Something that called to the part of me that had always been drawn to overlooked things, to the margins where secrets hid. That night, after Mrs. Pemberton had gone and the house had fallen into its uneasy silence, I sat at my window and wrote in the small journal I had kept since girlhood. I wrote about the Duke and his cold eyes, about the child who did not speak, about the marsh that stretched beyond my window like a gray and endless sea. I wrote about the strange feeling that had settled into my chest since my arrival, a feeling I could not quite name. It was only later, as I lay in my narrow bed listening to the wind moan against the old stones, that I realized what it was. It was the feeling of standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. The feeling that my life, so long defined by loss and limitation, was about to change in ways I could not yet imagine. I met Clara the following morning. She was waiting for me in the nursery, a small figure seated at a wooden table with a picture book open before her. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, falling in loose curls around a face that was pale and solemn and heartbreakingly young. When I entered, she looked up at me with eyes the gray of morning fog, and in those eyes I saw a sorrow so deep it took my breath away. "Good morning, Clara," I said softly, kneeling beside her so that our faces were level. "My name is Miss Ashcroft. I am going to be your governess. I hope we can be friends." She did not answer. She did not smile. She simply looked at me for a long moment, as though measuring my worth against some private standard, and then returned her attention to her book. The rejection should have stung, but instead I felt only a fierce and unexpected tenderness. I recognized something in this silent child, something that echoed in my own heart. She was not stubborn or defiant. She was simply lost, adrift in a grief too large for her small frame to carry. I pulled a chair beside her and sat down. "Shall I read to you?" I asked, and when she did not object, I took the book gently from her hands. It was a story about a princess locked in a tower, waiting for someone to rescue her. I read aloud in my clearest voice, pointing to the pictures as I went, and though Clara did not look at me, I noticed that her small hands had stilled in her lap. She was listening. That was enough. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. I woke early each morning and took my meals in the servants' hall, where the cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Brennan, regarded me with cautious curiosity, and the maids whispered among themselves whenever I passed. I spent the mornings in the nursery with Clara. Working through lessons she completed with mechanical precision but no apparent joy. In the afternoons when she rested, I was free to walk the grounds, or read in my room, or sit by the window watching the marsh. The Duke I saw rarely. He kept to his study, or rode out on his black horse to survey his tenant farms, returning only as darkness fell. When we passed in the corridors, he acknowledged me with a curt nod and nothing more. I told myself I was relieved by his distance, that his coldness made my position simpler. But sometimes, in unguarded moments, I found my thoughts drifting toward him, toward the shadows beneath his eyes and the way his voice had caught, almost imperceptibly, when he spoke of Clara. There was more to Edmund Hatherley than he wished the world to see. Of that, I was certain. It was on my 10th day at Ravenmoor that everything began to change. I had taken Clara for a walk in the garden, hoping the fresh air might coax some spark of life into her pale cheeks. We wandered among the dormant rose bushes and the bare-branched trees, her small hand clasped in mine, when she suddenly stopped. Her eyes were fixed on something in the distance, something beyond the garden wall, the marsh. She tugged at my hand, pulling me toward the edge of the property with a determination I had not seen in her before. I followed, uncertain but unwilling to deny her this first sign of interest in anything beyond her picture books. We reached the low stone wall that marked the boundary, and there we stood, looking out at the vast and misted expanse. Clara pointed. Her finger trembled slightly, but her meaning was clear. She wanted to go there. I knelt beside her, searching her face for some clue to this sudden fascination. "What is it?" I asked gently. "What do you see?" She did not answer, but for the first time since my arrival, I saw something in her eyes that was not sorrow. It was curiosity. It was longing. It was the look of a child who had found something worth reaching for. That night, I dreamed of the marsh. I dreamed I walked through its mist, my feet sinking into the soft earth, and somewhere ahead of me, just beyond the veil of fog, a light was burning. I woke with the strange certainty that the marsh held something hidden, something important, and I knew, with a conviction I could not explain, that I was meant to find it. The dream stayed with me for days, that vision of mist and hidden light, and though I tried to push it from my mind, I found my gaze drawn again and again to the marsh beyond my window. There was no rational explanation for my fascination. I was a practical woman, raised on scripture and science, and I did not believe in omens or premonitions. Yet something in that desolate landscape called to me, whispered to me in a language I could not quite understand. Clara felt it too. I was certain of it now. Each afternoon, when our lessons concluded and the nursery fell quiet, she would drift to the window and stand there, her small hand pressed against the glass, her eyes fixed on that gray horizon. She never spoke of it. She never spoke of anything. But I could see the longing in her posture, the way her whole body seemed to lean toward that distant place, and I wondered what connection this silent child had to a swamp that even the Duke himself had deemed worthless. It was Mrs. Pemberton who first told me the story of the marsh, though she did so reluctantly, as though the very words carried some contagion she wished to avoid. We were in the servants' hall one evening, the fire crackling low and the other staff retired to their rooms when I asked her why the Duke had sold the land so cheaply. She set down her mending and looked at me with those careful, measuring eyes. "You are curious about things that do not concern you, Miss Ashcroft." "I mean no disrespect," I said. "I only wish to understand this place." "And the child. She seems drawn to the marsh in a way I cannot explain." Mrs. Pemberton was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had softened, though only slightly. "The marsh has always been part of Ravenmoor," she said. "For generations, the Hatherleys have owned that land, though they have never known what to do with it. It floods in winter and breeds fever in summer. The tenants avoid it. The villagers say it is cursed." "Cursed?" She waved a hand dismissively. "Superstition, country folk, and their tales. But there is truth in this much. Nothing good has ever come from that place. His Grace's father tried to drain it once, 30 years ago. He spent a fortune on the endeavor and failed completely. The water always returned. After that, the family simply let it be." "And the Duke sold it last year," I said, "for £10. Mrs. Pemberton nodded. "A man came from London, a Mr. Cornelius Blackwood. He had grand plans, or so he claimed. He spoke of development, of turning the marsh into farmland, or perhaps building upon it. His Grace was only too happy to be rid of the burden. The sale was completed within a fortnight. But Mr. Blackwood never developed the land. No. He came once to survey it, walked the perimeter with his maps and his instruments, and then he left. That was 8 months ago. We have not seen him since. I imagine he discovered what every Hatherley has known for centuries, that marsh is good for nothing." I thanked her for the information and retired to my room, but I did not sleep. Instead, I sat at my desk and wrote down everything she had told me, adding it to the growing collection of observations in my journal. I had begun to keep detailed notes since my arrival, recording the rhythms of the household, the habits of its inhabitants, the peculiarities of the estate itself. It was a habit born of my father's teaching. He had always said that knowledge was the key to understanding, and understanding the key to wisdom. If I was to make sense of Ravenmoor and my place within it, I needed to gather as much information as I could. The following week brought an unexpected change to our routine. The Duke, who had until then shown no interest whatsoever in Clara's education, summoned me to his study to discuss her progress. I arrived at the appointed hour, my heart beating faster than I wished to admit, and found him standing by the window with his back to the door. "Close it behind you," he said without turning, and I obeyed. For a long moment he simply stood there, gazing out at the gray afternoon. I took the opportunity to study him more closely than I had before. He was tall and lean, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, but there was a weariness in the set of his shoulders that spoke of burdens carried too long. His hands, clasped behind his back, were the hands of a gentleman, long-fingered, elegant, unstained by labor. Yet I noticed that his cuffs were slightly frayed, and the fabric of his coat, though well cut, had seen better days. "Miss Ashcroft," he said at last, turning to face me, "how do you find my ward?" "She is intelligent, Your Grace, observant. She completes her lessons with precision and demonstrates a natural aptitude for reading and drawing, but she remains silent. I have tried every approach I know, and still she will not speak." He nodded slowly, as though this news was no surprise. "The doctors say it is a nervous condition, that she has retreated into herself as a protection against some trauma she cannot face." His voice was flat, carefully controlled, but I heard the strain beneath it. "They say she may recover in time, or she may not. They cannot tell me which." "May I ask," I said carefully, "what trauma befell her? You mentioned that she came to live here 6 months ago, after your cousin's death. Was it the loss of her parents that caused this?" The Duke's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. A shadow passing across deep water. "My cousin Eleanor was a widow," he said. "Her husband died before Clara was born. Eleanor raised the child alone in a small cottage on the far edge of my lands. They lived simply, quietly. I confess I did not know them well. Eleanor and I had been close as children, but we grew apart as adults do. I saw her perhaps twice a year, at Christmas and on her birthday. I knew Clara only as a name, a small figure glimpsed at a distance. What happened to Eleanor?" He turned back to the window. "There was a fire," he said quietly. "The cottage burned in the night. Eleanor did not survive. Clara was found outside, in the garden, unharmed but unable to speak. She has not uttered a word since." The weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. I thought of Clara's gray eyes, the sorrow that lived within them, and I understood now the depth of what she had lost. She had watched her mother's home burn. Perhaps she had watched her mother die. No wonder she had retreated into silence. What words could possibly encompass such grief? "I am sorry," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "I am so very sorry." The Duke did not acknowledge my sympathy. He remained at the window, his face in profile, and I saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. "There is something else," he said. "Something the doctors do not know. Something I have told no one." I waited, hardly daring to breathe. The fire was no accident. He spoke so softly I had to strain to hear him. Someone said it deliberately. I found evidence afterward, though I could not prove it to the magistrate's satisfaction. Someone wanted Eleanor dead, Miss Ashcroft, and I do not know why. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. I stared at him, my mind racing. Who would want to harm a widow living quietly in a cottage? What possible motive could there be for such a terrible act? "You believe Clara is in danger," I said. "That is why you keep her here, in this isolated place. You are trying to protect her." He turned then, and for the first time since my arrival, I saw something other than coldness in his gaze. There was fear there, fear and guilt and a desperate, helpless love that he could not quite conceal. "I failed Eleanor," he said. "I was her family, her protector by blood and duty, and I failed her. I will not fail her daughter. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I will keep Clara safe. I left the study with my thoughts in turmoil. The Duke's confession had changed everything. This was no longer simply a matter of a grieving child and a cold-hearted nobleman. There was danger here, real and present danger, and I was caught in the middle of it. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, turning the puzzle over and over in my mind. Who had set the fire that killed Eleanor? What secret had she possessed that was worth killing for? And what did any of it have to do with the marsh that seemed to hold such fascination for her daughter? I rose before dawn and dressed quietly, pulling on my warmest cloak and my sturdiest boots. The house was still sleeping as I slipped out through the servants' entrance and made my way across the frost-covered grounds. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, a pale wash of gray that promised another cold and sunless day. My breath formed clouds before me as I walked, and the grass crunched beneath my feet like broken glass. I did not know what I was looking for. I only knew that I could not sit idle any longer, waiting for answers that might never come. If there were secrets to be found, I would find them myself. The stone wall that marked the estate's boundary was lower than I had remembered, worn down by time and weather. I climbed over it easily and stood on the other side, looking out at the marsh. Up close, it was even more forbidding than it had appeared from my window. The ground was soft and treacherous, thick with mud and tangled roots. Pools of dark water glinted between the tussocks of dead grass, and the skeletal trees that dotted the landscape reached toward the sky like grasping hands. I picked my way forward carefully, testing each step before committing my weight. The mist that clung to the surface swirled around my ankles, cold and damp, and the smell of the place filled my nostrils, rich and earthy and faintly sulphurous, like something buried long ago and slowly rotting. It was not a pleasant smell, yet there was something strangely compelling about it, something that made me want to go deeper, to see what lay beyond the veil of fog. I walked for perhaps a quarter of an hour, following no particular path, simply letting my instincts guide me. The sun rose higher, though its light barely penetrated the mist, and the world around me remained gray and muted. I was beginning to think I had come on a fool's errand when I saw it. A glint of something on the ground, half hidden beneath a fallen log. I knelt down, heedless of the mud soaking through my skirts, and brushed away the debris. What I found made my heart stop. It was a tin box, small and rusted, the kind used to store documents or keepsakes. The lid was dented but still intact, and when I pried it open, I found inside a collection of papers, yellowed with age and spotted with mildew but still legible. There were letters, a dozen or more, written in a feminine hand I did not recognize. And beneath the letters, folded carefully, was a map. I spread the map across my knees and studied it in the dim light. It was a survey of the marsh, drawn with professional precision, complete with measurements and notations, but it was the markings in the center that caught my attention. Someone had circled an area near the heart of the swamp and written beside it a single word: oil. I sat there in the mud, the map trembling in my hands, and felt the world tilt beneath me. Oil. The word echoed in my mind like a bell tolling. I knew enough of the modern world to understand what this meant. Oil was valuable, increasingly so, as the machines of industry spread across England and beyond. If there was truly oil beneath this marsh, then the land the Duke had sold for £10 was worth a fortune. But who had made this map? And how had it come to be hidden here, in a rusted box beneath a fallen log? I gathered the papers carefully and tucked them inside my cloak. My hands were shaking, though whether from cold or excitement I could not say. I needed to return to the house. I needed to think. I needed to understand what I had found and what it meant. The walk back seemed longer than the walk out. My mind raced with questions and possibilities, each more troubling than the last. If there was oil in the marsh, and if someone had known about it, Then the sale of the land took on an entirely different significance. Had the Duke been deceived? Had he sold a fortune for a pittance, unaware of what lay beneath the surface? Or was there something more sinister at work? I thought of Eleanor, dead in a fire that was no accident. I thought of Clara, silent and grieving, drawn inexplicably to this forgotten place. And I thought of the Duke himself, with his cold eyes and his hidden pain, a man who carried guilt like a second skin. The answers were here. I could feel it. Hidden in the marsh, hidden in the letters I carried against my chest, hidden in the tangled web of secrets that surrounded this family. I had only to find them. I reached the garden wall just as the household was beginning to stir. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, and I could hear the distant clatter of pots being readied for breakfast. I climbed over the wall and hurried across the grounds, my cloak clutched tight around me, praying that no one had noticed my absence. I was nearly to the servants' entrance when a voice stopped me cold. "Miss Ashcroft." I turned. The Duke stood on the gravel path behind me, dressed for riding, his dark horse waiting nearby. His eyes moved over my muddied skirts, my disheveled hair, the bulge beneath my cloak where the tin box pressed against my ribs. His expression was unreadable. "You have been walking," he observed. "Yes, Your Grace." I could not sleep. I thought the fresh air might clear my head. In the marsh. It was not a question. I felt my face flush, and I knew that denial was useless. "Yes," I admitted. "In the marsh." He took a step toward me, and I forced myself not to retreat. His gaze was intent, searching, as though he could see through my cloak to the secrets I carried beneath it. "That land is not safe, Miss Ashcroft. It is treacherous and unpredictable. I would ask that you confine your walks to the grounds of the estate in future." "Of course, Your Grace." "Forgive me. I did not mean to cause concern." He studied me for a moment longer, and I had the strangest feeling that he knew, that he saw the questions burning in my eyes and understood that I had found something out there in the mist. But he said nothing more. He simply nodded once, turned, and mounted his horse. I watched him ride away, my heart pounding against my ribs, and I knew that everything had changed. I had come to Ravenmoor seeking employment. I had found something far more dangerous. I had found a secret worth killing for. I did not read the letters immediately. Some instinct warned me to wait, to find a moment of true privacy before I unveiled whatever secrets they contained. The household was waking around me, and I could not risk being discovered with evidence of my transgression. So I hid the tin box beneath a loose floorboard in my room, a space I had discovered during my first week when the wood creaked beneath my foot, and I forced myself to go about my day as though nothing had changed. It was the longest day of my life. I sat with Clara in the nursery, guiding her through her lessons with a patience I did not feel, while my mind churned with questions I could not answer. Who had made that map? How had Eleanor come to possess it? And did her death have something to do with the fortune hidden beneath the marsh? Clara seemed to sense my distraction. More than once I caught her watching me with those solemn gray eyes, a faint crease between her brows as though she were trying to puzzle out my thoughts. I smiled at her each time, hoping to reassure her, but I could see that she was not convinced. This child, for all her silence, was remarkably perceptive. She noticed things that others missed. She understood more than she revealed. It was late afternoon when something unexpected happened. We had finished our reading lesson and were sitting together by the window, looking out at the garden, when Clara reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object. She held it out to me without a word, her expression intent and serious. It was a locket, tarnished silver, oval in shape, hanging from a delicate chain. I took it carefully, turning it over in my hands. The surface was engraved with a pattern of roses, worn smooth by years of handling. When I pressed the tiny clasp, it opened to reveal two miniature portraits, a woman with Clara's autumn hair and gentle features, and a man with dark eyes and a kind smile. "Your parents," I said softly. "This belonged to your mother." Clara nodded. It was the first direct communication we had shared, and I felt tears prick at my eyes. She was trusting me with something precious, something that connected her to the life she had lost. I understood the magnitude of that gift. "She was beautiful," I said, studying Eleanor's painted face. "You look just like her." Clara's lower lip trembled. For a moment, I thought she might speak, might finally break the silence that had held her captive for so long. But instead, she simply pointed to the locket, and then to me, her meaning clear. She wanted me to keep it. "I cannot take this," I said gently. "It belongs to you. It is all you have left of her." But Clara shook her head firmly and pressed the locket into my palm, closing my fingers around it. Her eyes met mine, and in their depths I saw something that made my breath catch. Trust. Complete and absolute trust, offered without reservation. "I will keep it safe," I promised her. "And when you are ready, when you want it back, you need only ask." That evening, after Clara had been put to bed and the house had fallen quiet, I finally retrieved the tin box from its hiding place. I lit a candle at my desk, drew the curtains tight against the darkness outside, and opened the lid with trembling hands. The letters were fragile, their edges crumbling at my touch, and I handled them with the utmost care. There were 14 in total, spanning a period of nearly 2 years. The handwriting was Eleanor's. I recognized it from a sample Mrs. Pemberton had shown me when I first arrived, a note Eleanor had written years ago that still hung in the kitchen. But the content of these letters was nothing like the simple domestic correspondence I had expected. They were addressed to someone named Marcus, though no surname was given. The earliest letters were formal, almost businesslike, discussing arrangements and agreements I did not fully understand. But as I read on, the tone shifted. There was warmth in the later letters, gratitude, and something that might have been affection. I pieced together the story slowly, reading and rereading until the candle burned low and my eyes ached from strain. Eleanor had discovered something on the marsh, something she did not fully understand. She had sought help from this Marcus, a man with knowledge of geology and minerals, and he had confirmed her suspicions. There was oil beneath the swamp, a vast deposit that could be worth thousands of pounds. But Eleanor had been afraid. The letters spoke of her fear in veiled terms, never quite naming the source of her anxiety. She mentioned powerful interests, men who would stop at nothing to claim what they wanted. She wrote of precautions taken, of evidence hidden, of a plan to reveal the truth when the time was right. And then the letters stopped. The final one was dated just 3 weeks before the fire that killed her. I sat in the darkness, the locket warm against my palm, and felt the weight of what I had learned settle over me. Eleanor had known about the oil. She had known, and she had tried to protect that knowledge, and someone had killed her for it. But who? And how had the marsh come to be sold to Mr. Blackwood for such a pittance if Eleanor had evidence of its true value? The answer came to me slowly, terribly, as I stared at the dying flame of my candle. The Duke had sold the land. The Duke, who claimed to have barely known his cousin. The Duke, who had brought Clara to live in his isolated estate, far from prying eyes. No. I pushed the thought away as soon as it formed. I had seen the guilt in his eyes when he spoke of Eleanor. I had heard the grief in his voice. Whatever else Edmund Hatherley might be, he was not a murderer. I was certain of it. But someone was. The days that followed were a delicate dance of normalcy and investigation. I continued my duties with Clara, maintained my careful distance from the Duke, and used every spare moment to pursue the truth. I searched the estate library for books on geology and mineral extraction. I questioned Mrs. Pemberton about the history of the marsh, though I was careful to frame my curiosity as simple interest rather than suspicion. I even wrote a letter to the agency in London, asking discreetly for any information they might have about a man named Marcus who worked with minerals and land surveys. It was during this time that something unexpected began to happen. The Duke, who had been so distant since my arrival, started to seek me out. He would appear in the nursery doorway during Clara's lessons, watching silently for a few moments before moving on. He would find me in the library and ask what I was reading, his dark eyes lingering on the spines of the books I had chosen. Once, he came upon me in the garden at dusk and walked beside me in silence for nearly a quarter of an hour before bidding me good evening and returning to the house. I did not know what to make of these encounters. There was nothing improper in them. Nothing that could be called attention or interest in the way a man might show interest in a woman. Yet there was something in his manner that had shifted, a softening of the sharp edges I had encountered when we first met. He asked about Clara's progress with what seemed like genuine concern. He inquired after my comfort in the household. He even, on one memorable occasion, asked about my father and listened with apparent attention as I spoke of the man who had shaped my life. "You loved him very much," he said when I finished, and there was no mockery in his voice. Only a quiet recognition that surprised me. "He was my whole world," I replied. "When he died, I thought I would never feel whole again." The Duke was silent for a long moment. Then he said softly, "I know what it is to lose the person who made you who you are. My mother died when I was 12. She was gentle and kind, and she believed in me when no one else did. After she was gone, my father made certain I understood that gentleness was weakness, that kindness was a luxury the Duke of Ravenmoor could not afford." "I am sorry," I said. "That must have been very lonely." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I felt something pass between us. A recognition of shared pain, perhaps. An acknowledgement that we were both, in our different ways, survivors of loss. "You are good with Clara," he said abruptly, changing the subject with the awkwardness of a man unaccustomed to vulnerability. "She is changing, opening. I see it in the way she looks at you. She is a remarkable child. She has endured more than any child should have to endure, and yet there is still light in her. I see it when she draws. I see it when she looks out at the garden. She is not broken, Your Grace. She is merely waiting." Waiting for what? I considered the question carefully before answering. For someone to show her that it is safe to feel again, that she can love without losing, that the world, for all its cruelty, still holds goodness worth reaching for. The Duke did not respond immediately. He turned away, and I thought I saw a tremor pass through his shoulders, though it might have been a trick of the fading light. "You speak as though you know this from experience, Miss Ashcroft." I smiled, though he could not see it. "Perhaps I do, Your Grace. Perhaps we all do in our own way." It was Clara who gave me my next clue. We were in the nursery one rainy afternoon, the weather too foul for our usual walk in the garden, when she brought me her sketchbook. She had been drawing all morning, bent over her paper with an intensity that bordered on obsession, and now she held out the result for my inspection. The drawing stole my breath. It was the marsh, rendered in charcoal with a skill far beyond her years. The skeletal trees, the pools of dark water, the mist that clung to the surface like a living thing. All of it captured with an accuracy that spoke of deep familiarity, as though she had walked that landscape 1,000 times in her dreams. But it was not the landscape that made me gasp. It was the figure in the center of the drawing, a woman standing at the edge of a pool, her back to the viewer. Her hair was loose and wild, streaming in an invisible wind, and in her hands she held what appeared to be a tin box. Eleanor. It had to be Eleanor. Clara had drawn her mother in the marsh, holding the very box I had found buried beneath the fallen log. I knelt beside her, my heart racing. "Clara," I said gently, "did you see this? Did you see your mother in the marsh?" She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the drawing. "When? Before the fire?" Another nod. I took her small hands in mine, feeling them tremble. What else did you see? Was there someone with her? Someone who should not have been there? Clara's face went pale. Her breathing quickened, and I saw the fear rise in her eyes like floodwater. I had pushed too hard, asked too much. She was retreating again, pulling back into the safety of her silence. I am sorry, I said quickly. I should not have pressed you. You do not have to tell me anything you are not ready to share. But Clara, if you ever want to talk about what you saw, I am here. I will listen. I will believe you. She stared at me for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she raised one hand and pointed at the drawing, not at her mother, not at the marsh, at something in the corner I had not noticed before. A figure, half hidden in the mist, a man in a dark coat watching. "Who is that?" I whispered. Clara shook her head. She did not know. But she had seen him. On the night her mother died, or perhaps before, she had seen a stranger lurking in the marsh. I held her close, feeling her small body shake with suppressed sobs, and I made a silent vow. I would find this man. I would discover the truth of what had happened to Eleanor, and I would make certain that no harm ever came to her daughter. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, turning over everything I had learned. The oil beneath the marsh, the letters to Marcus, the stranger in Clara's drawing. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, though the whole remained frustratingly incomplete. Someone had known about the oil before the Duke sold the land. Someone had wanted that knowledge silenced. Eleanor had died, and the marsh had passed into the hands of Mr. Cornelius Blackwood for a price so low it was practically a gift. Blackwood. The name echoed in my mind. Mrs. Pemberton had said he came from London, that he had surveyed the land once and never returned. But what if his absence was not defeat? What if it was patience? What if he was waiting for something or someone before claiming his prize? I needed to learn more about this man. I needed to know who he was, where he came from, and how he had known to buy that particular piece of worthless land at that particular moment in time. And I needed to do it without alerting whoever had killed Eleanor to my investigation. The following morning, I requested permission to visit the village. Mrs. Pemberton granted it reluctantly, warning me that the roads were poor and the weather unpredictable, but I assured her I would be careful. I borrowed a horse from the stables and set out before noon, my cloak pulled tight against the wind. The village of Thornwick lay 3 miles from Ravenmoor, a small cluster of cottages and shops huddled around a grey stone church. I had not visited since my arrival, and I was struck by how quiet it seemed. How watchful the faces that turned toward me as I rode down the main street. I was a stranger here, an outsider associated with the great house on the hill, and I could feel the weight of their suspicion like a physical presence. I stopped at the inn, a modest establishment called the Lamb and Crown, and inquired about Mr. Cornelius Blackwood. The innkeeper, a stout man with a graying beard, regarded me with undisguised curiosity. "Blackwood?" he repeated. I remember him. Came through last spring, he did. Stayed 2 nights while he looked over the marsh. Kept to himself mostly. Asked a lot of questions about the land, the history, who owned what and for how long. Did he say why he was interested in the marsh?" The innkeeper shrugged. Said he was an investor, looking for opportunities. But there was something off about him, if you take my meaning. He had the look of a man with secrets. I was not sorry to see him go. Did anyone else come asking about the marsh? Before Mr. Blackwood, or after? The innkeeper's eyes narrowed. Now that you mention it, there was another fellow. Came about a year before Blackwood, maybe a bit longer. Young man, well-spoken. Had the air of a scholar about him. He spent weeks tramping around the marsh with his instruments and his notebooks. He stayed at the boarding house down the road. Mrs. Croft might remember him better than I. I thanked him and made my way to the boarding house, my pulse quickening with each step. A scholar with instruments, a man who studied the land. Could this be Marcus, the recipient of Eleanor's letters? Mrs. Croft was a sharp-eyed widow who examined me thoroughly before agreeing to answer my questions. Yes, she remembered the young man. His name was Marcus Whitmore, a geologist from Cambridge. He had come to study the mineral composition of the marshland and had stayed for nearly 2 months. He was a kind soul, she said, her expression softening. Quiet, serious, always with his head in a book. He spoke to me sometimes of his work, said the marsh was more valuable than anyone knew. But then he left suddenly, without explanation, paid his bill and was gone within the hour. When was this? She thought for a moment. Late autumn, year before last, not long before that terrible fire at the Hatherley cottage. My blood ran cold. Marcus had discovered the oil. He had told Eleanor, and then, shortly before her death, he had vanished. Did anyone come looking for him afterward? Mrs. Croft nodded slowly. A man in a dark coat, she said, well dressed with a London accent. He asked the same questions you are asking now. I told him what I knew, which was nothing. Mr. Whitmore left no forwarding address. A man in a dark coat. The same figure Clara had drawn, lurking in the marsh. I rode back to Ravenmoor as the sun began to set, my mind racing with the implications of what I had learned. Marcus Whitmore had discovered the oil and shared his findings with Eleanor. Then he had disappeared, and shortly afterward, Eleanor had died in a fire that was no accident. Now a stranger was asking questions, following the same trail I was following. I was getting closer to the truth. But the truth, I was beginning to realize, was more dangerous than I had ever imagined. As I approached the estate, I saw a figure waiting at the gate. The Duke stood there in the gathering dusk, his dark horse beside him, his face unreadable in the fading light. "Miss Ashcroft," he said as I drew near, "you have been gone a long time. I had business in the village, Your Grace." "What manner of business?" I hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. He watched me with those storm-gray eyes, and I felt as though he could see every secret I was hiding. "I was asking about the marsh," I said finally. "About the man who bought it." The Duke's expression did not change, but I saw his hands tighten on the reins. "And what did you learn?" "I learned that there is more to that land than anyone supposed. I learned that someone knew its value before you sold it. And I learned that your cousin Eleanor may have died because of what she discovered there." The silence that followed was absolute. The wind had stilled, and even the birds had fallen quiet. The Duke stared at me for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw something I had not expected. Hope. "Then, Miss Ashcroft," he said softly, "it seems we have much to discuss." We sat in his study until the fire burned to embers and the candles guttered in their holders, and I told him everything. The letters I had found in the marsh, the map with its damning notation, Marcus Whitmore, the vanished geologist, the stranger in the dark coat who had come asking questions, Clara's drawing of her mother standing at the edge of the water, watched by a figure half hidden in the mist. The Duke listened without interruption, his face pale in the flickering light. When I finished, he rose and walked to the window, staring out at the darkness beyond the glass. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clenched at his sides, and I could see the effort it cost him to maintain his composure. "I sold that land for £10, he said quietly. £10 for a fortune. And Eleanor died because she knew what I was too blind to see." "You could not have known," I said. "The oil was hidden. It took a trained geologist to find it, but Eleanor knew. She tried to tell me once." He turned to face me, and I saw the anguish in his eyes. "She came to me a year before she died. She said she had discovered something important on the marsh, something that could change everything. I thought she was being fanciful. I told her the marsh was worthless, that she should focus on raising her daughter and leave business matters to those who understood them. The cruelty of his words hung in the air between us, though I knew he had not meant them cruelly at the time. He had been a product of his upbringing, a man taught to dismiss the insights of women, and now he was paying the price for that blindness. "What happened then?" I asked. "She left." He spoke the word as though it pained him. "She left, and I did not see her again until I received word of the fire. By then, it was too late. She was gone, and Clara was alone, and I had failed them both." I rose from my chair and crossed the room to stand beside him. The impropriety of the gesture did not occur to me until later. In that moment, I felt only a deep and urgent need to offer comfort to a man who had carried his guilt alone for far too long. "You did not kill her," I said firmly. "Someone else did that. Someone who wanted the oil badly enough to murder for it. Our task now is to find that person and bring them to justice." He looked down at me, and something in his expression shifted. The coldness that had defined him since my arrival seemed to crack, revealing glimpses of the man beneath. He was not heartless, I realized. He was wounded, deeply and perhaps irreparably, and he had built walls around himself to keep the pain at bay. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You are a governess. This is not your concern. You could leave tomorrow, find a position elsewhere, and never think of Ravenmoor again." "I could," I admitted. "But I will not." "Why?" The question demanded honesty, and I gave it. "Because Clara trusts me," I said. "Because Eleanor deserved better than an unmarked grave and an unsolved murder. And because I cannot walk away from injustice, no matter how powerful the forces behind it." He studied my face for a long moment, as though searching for some sign of deception. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, for he nodded slowly. "Very well, Miss Ashcroft. We will pursue this together. But you must promise me something." "What is that?" "If it becomes dangerous, if you sense that you are in any peril, you will tell me immediately. I will not have another death on my conscience." I gave him my word, though even as I spoke, I knew that danger was already closer than either of us suspected. The following days brought a new rhythm to my life at Ravenmoor. The Duke and I met each evening in his study, poring over the letters and the map, discussing what we knew and what we still needed to discover. He wrote to contacts in London, making discreet inquiries about Cornelius Blackwood and his business dealings. I continued my research in the estate library, seeking any information that might shed light on the history of the marsh or the nature of the oil that lay beneath it. Our conversations during these evening sessions ranged far beyond the immediate mystery. We spoke of books and ideas, of politics and philosophy, of our childhoods and our dreams. I learned that he had once wanted to be a scholar, that he had spent a year at Oxford studying ancient languages before his father's death had summoned him home to assume the title. He learned of my father's teaching, of the education I had received that was so unusual for a woman of my station, of the loneliness I had felt since his passing. It was during one of these evenings that he first called me by my Christian name. We had been debating the merits of a particular translation of Homer, a subject about which we both held strong opinions, when he laughed at something I said. The sound startled me. I had not heard him laugh before. It transformed his face entirely, smoothing the sharp lines and softening the severe angles. And for a moment, I glimpsed the young man he must have been before duty and loss had hardened him. "You are a remarkable woman, Rosalind," he said, and then stopped, as though surprised by his own familiarity. I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "If we are to be allies in this endeavor, Your Grace," I said carefully, "perhaps some informality is warranted." "Edmund," he said. "My name is Edmund. I would be honored if you would use it." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Something had shifted between us, something I did not fully understand and was not certain I wished to examine too closely. We were employer and employee, Duke and Governess, separated by gulfs of rank and wealth that could never be bridged. Whatever warmth I felt in his presence was a luxury I could not afford. And yet, as I lay in my bed that night, I could not stop thinking of the way he had looked at me when he spoke my name. There had been something in his eyes that went beyond gratitude or respect, something that made my heart race and my breath catch and my carefully ordered world feel suddenly, dangerously unstable. Clara continued to improve as the weeks passed. She had not yet spoken, but her silences were no longer quite so heavy. She smiled more often, engaged more fully with her lessons, and even began to join me for walks in the garden without being prompted. The connection between us had deepened into something that felt almost like family, and I found myself dreading the day when circumstances might force us apart. It was Clara who provided the breakthrough we needed. One afternoon, as we sat together in the nursery, she brought me a new drawing. This one was different from her usual landscapes and still lifes. It was a portrait, rendered with the same startling skill she brought to all her work, of a man's face. He was perhaps 40 years of age, with a thin mouth and narrow eyes and hair that receded sharply from a high forehead. There was something cold in his expression, something calculating that made me shiver despite the warmth of the room. "Who is this?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Clara pointed to her earlier drawing, the one of the marsh with the figure half hidden in the mist. This was the same man, the stranger she had seen watching her mother. "Have you seen him anywhere else?" "At the village, perhaps, or on the road?" She nodded slowly and pointed toward the window. I followed her gaze, my heart beginning to pound. The window overlooked the garden, and beyond the garden lay the path that led to the marsh. He was here? At Ravenmoor? Another nod. Clara's face had gone pale, and I could see the fear rising in her eyes, but she did not retreat into silence. Instead, she took my hand and squeezed it tightly, as though drawing strength from my presence. "When did you see him?" She held up 3 fingers. 3 days ago. I kept my voice calm, though my mind was racing. "Did he see you?" She shook her head. "Good. You did the right thing in telling me, Clara. You are very brave. Now I need you to promise me something. If you ever see this man again, do not approach him. Do not let him know you have seen him. Come find me or the Duke immediately. Can you do that?" She nodded solemnly, and I pulled her into an embrace, holding her small body close. Whoever this man was, he was watching us. He had been at Ravenmoor just days ago, observing the house, perhaps waiting for an opportunity. We were running out of time. I found Edmund in his study and showed him Clara's drawing. His reaction was immediate and alarming. He went white, then red, his jaw tightening with barely contained fury. "He has been here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "On my land, watching my ward. By God, I will find this man, and I will make him answer for what he has done." "We must be strategic," I cautioned. "If we move too quickly, we may alert him. He could flee before we learn the truth. Then what do you suggest?" I had been thinking about this since Clara showed me the drawing. "Cornelius Blackwood," I said. "He is the key. He bought the marsh knowing its value. He must have learned about the oil from someone with knowledge of what Marcus Whitmore discovered. If we can prove a connection between Blackwood and this stranger, we will have evidence to bring before the magistrate." Edmund considered this. "I have received word from my contacts in London," he said. "Blackwood is a speculator, as we suspected. He has made his fortune buying land cheaply and selling it dear. But there is more. He has a partner, a man named Victor Ashworth, who handles the less savory aspects of his business dealings." "Ashworth," I repeated. "Could he be the man in Clara's drawing?" "It is possible." My contact was unable to provide a physical description, but he confirmed that Ashworth has a reputation for ruthlessness. There are rumors that he has silenced those who stood in the way of Blackwood's acquisitions before. The pieces were falling into place. Blackwood and Ashworth had learned of the oil, possibly from Marcus Whitmore himself. They had conspired to acquire the land cheaply, eliminating Eleanor when she threatened to expose the truth. and now they were watching Ravenmoor, waiting for something. But what were they waiting for? The answer came to me in a flash of terrible clarity. "The sale," I said. "The sale is not yet final." "Is it?" Edmund stared at me. "How did you know?" "I did not know. I guessed, but your reaction confirms it. Tell me." He sighed heavily. "The sale was complicated by legal disputes over the boundary lines. My solicitor has been working to resolve them, but the final transfer of the deed has not yet occurred. Until it does, the land technically remains part of the Ravenmoor estate. So if something were to happen to you before the sale was finalized, the land would pass to my heir, or, if I died without issue, to the crown. Either way, Blackwood's claim would be void. And if evidence of the oil's existence were to emerge before the sale was complete, you could challenge the transaction. You could argue that you were deceived, that Blackwood knowingly purchased property worth far more than the price he paid." "Exactly." Edmund's eyes met mine, and I saw understanding dawn in their depths. They are not merely watching. They are waiting for the right moment to strike. And if they learn that we know the truth, that moment will come much sooner than we expect. We spent the rest of that evening making plans. Edmund would accelerate his inquiries in London, using every connection at his disposal to gather evidence against Blackwood and Ashworth. I would continue to search the estate for any additional documents Eleanor might have left behind, and together we would ensure that Clara was never left unprotected. It was late when I finally rose to leave. The fire had burned down to coals, and the candles cast long shadows across the book-lined walls. I gathered my shawl around my shoulders and turned toward the door, but Edmund's voice stopped me. "Rosalind." I turned. He was standing by the fireplace, his face half in shadow, and there was something in his expression I could not quite read. "Thank you," he said, "for everything you have done, for Clara, for Eleanor, for me. I do not know what I would have done if you had not come to Ravenmoor." I smiled, though my heart was aching with feelings I dared not name. "You would have found the truth eventually, Edmund. You are not the cold man you pretend to be." He took a step toward me, then stopped, as though restrained by some invisible force. "Perhaps not," he said softly, "but I was cold before you came." I had forgotten what it felt like to care for anything beyond duty and obligation. "You have reminded me that there is more to life than simply enduring it." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I knew I should leave, should retreat to the safety of my room and the distance it would afford. But I could not move. I stood there, caught in his gaze, and felt the world narrow to the space between us. It was Edmund who broke the spell. He looked away, clearing his throat, and when he spoke again, his voice had returned to its usual composure. "Good night, Rosalind. Sleep well. Tomorrow we continue our work." "Good night, Edmund," I whispered, and fled before I could say anything more. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried to make sense of the tumult in my heart. I was falling in love with him. The realization struck me like a blow, undeniable and terrifying. I, Rosalind Ashcroft, a penniless governess with no prospects and no future, had fallen in love with a duke. It was impossible. It was foolish. It was the most certain path to heartbreak I could imagine, and yet I could not stop it. Every moment in his presence only deepened my feelings, only made the inevitable parting more painful to contemplate. I told myself it did not matter. We had more pressing concerns than the longings of my heart. There was a murderer to unmask, a child to protect, justice to be served. I would focus on those tasks and set aside my feelings until they faded with time and distance. But even as I made this resolution, I knew it was a lie. Some feelings, once kindled, do not fade. They burn brighter with each passing day, consuming everything in their path until there is nothing left but ash and memory. I rose before dawn and dressed quickly, determined to throw myself into the work ahead. There was still so much to do, still so many questions without answers. And somewhere out there, a man in a dark coat was watching, waiting for his moment to strike. Whatever came next, I would face it with courage, for Clara, for Eleanor, for the man I loved but could never have. The sun was rising over the marsh when I looked out my window, painting the mist in shades of gold and rose. It was beautiful, I thought. Desolate and dangerous, but beautiful nonetheless. Like so much of life, it held both darkness and light, and the challenge was to find the light without being consumed by the dark. I pressed my hand against the glass, feeling the cold seep through to my skin, and made myself a promise. Before this was over, the truth would come to light. Eleanor would have justice, Clara would have peace, and I would have done something that mattered, something that made a difference in this world of sorrow and secrets. It was the best I could hope for. It would have to be enough. The storm came without warning on the last night of November, sweeping in from the north with a fury that rattled the windows of Ravenmoor and turned the world outside into a chaos of wind and rain. I stood at my window watching the lightning split the sky, and I felt in my bones that something was about to change. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, as though the heavens knew what we did not. That before the dawn, the truth would finally come to light. It began with a scream. I was in my room, preparing for bed, when the sound tore through the house. High and thin and terrified, it was the voice of a child, Clara's voice. I ran without thinking, my feet bare against the cold floors, my heart pounding so hard I could hear nothing else. The nursery door stood open, and inside I found chaos. The window had been shattered, glass scattered across the floor like fallen stars, and the curtains billowed in the wind. Clara's bed was empty, her blankets thrown aside, and standing in the center of the room was the man from her drawings, Victor Ashworth. I knew him instantly, though we had never met. The thin mouth, the narrow eyes, the cold calculation in his gaze. He turned when I entered, and I saw Clara in his arms, her small body rigid with fear, her gray eyes wide and wild. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, and his voice was smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "How convenient. I had hoped to avoid complications, but it seems fate has other plans. Let her go." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Whatever you want, she cannot give it to you. She is only a child who saw too much." His grip on Clara tightened, and she whimpered. I have waited months for the right opportunity. Months of watching and planning, waiting for the old fool to finalize the sale so that Blackwood could claim what is rightfully his. But you have been asking questions, Miss Ashcroft. You and the Duke, digging into matters that do not concern you. I cannot allow that to continue. "The oil," I said. "You killed Eleanor because she knew about the oil." Ashworth's lips curved into something that might have been a smile. Eleanor was a foolish woman. She discovered the geologist's findings and thought she could use them to improve her daughter's circumstances. She came to Blackwood with an offer, her silence in exchange for a share of the profits. He agreed, of course, and then he sent me to ensure she would never speak of it again. The casual cruelty of his words made my stomach turn. "But you made a mistake," I said, fighting to keep him talking while my mind raced for a way to free Clara. "You let the child live. The child was supposed to die in the fire." His voice hardened, but she escaped. When I learned she had been taken in by the Duke, I thought it would not matter. She had not spoken since that night. Who would believe the ravings of a mute child? But then you came, Miss Ashcroft. You, with your questions and your kindness, and your stubborn refusal to leave well enough alone. You have given her hope, and hope is a dangerous thing. He began to move toward the broken window, dragging Clara with him. I knew with terrible certainty what he intended. He would take her into the storm, into the marsh, and she would vanish as completely as her mother had. No one would ever know what had happened to her. I could not let that happen. I lunged forward, throwing myself at Ashworth with every ounce of strength I possessed. He was larger than me, stronger, but I had the advantage of surprise. My shoulder connected with his chest, and he stumbled backward, his grip on Clara loosening. She fell to the floor with a cry, and I shouted at her to run, to find the Duke, to get help. But Clara did not run. She scrambled to her feet and stood there, trembling, her eyes fixed on the struggle before her. And then she did something that stopped my heart. She spoke. "Leave her alone." The words were small and hoarse, rusted from months of disuse, but they rang through the room like a bell. Ashworth froze, his hand raised to strike me, and turned to stare at the child he had thought forever silenced. It was the distraction I needed. I grabbed a shard of glass from the floor and slashed at his arm, drawing blood and a howl of pain. He released me, clutching his wound, and I pushed Clara behind me, shielding her with my body. The door burst open. Edmund stood in the threshold, a pistol in his hand, his face pale with fury. Behind him, I could see Mrs. Pemberton and two of the footmen, their expressions grim with purpose. "Step away from them," Edmund said, his voice carrying the cold authority of generations of aristocratic command. "Step away, or I will shoot you where you stand." Ashworth looked from the pistol to the broken window, calculating his chances. For a moment I thought he might try to flee, but then his shoulders sagged, and I saw defeat settle over him like a shroud. "It is over," I said quietly. "Whatever Blackwood promised you, it was not worth this. It was never worth this." They took him away in chains, bundled into a carriage bound for the magistrate in the village. The storm raged on outside, but inside Ravenmoor, a different kind of storm was subsiding. Clara clung to me as though I were the only solid thing in a world gone mad, and I held her close, stroking her hair and murmuring words of comfort until her trembling eased. "She spoke to me," I said to Edmund when he returned from seeing Ashworth secured. "She spoke." He knelt beside us, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I heard," he said. "I heard her." Clara looked up at him, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something other than sorrow in her face. There was trust there, and hope, and the fragile beginnings of peace. "He hurt my mother," she said, her voice still rough but growing stronger with each word. "I saw him. I saw him set the fire. I tried to tell someone, but the words would not come. They got stuck inside me, and I could not make them come out." Edmund reached out and took her small hand in his. "You do not have to be afraid anymore," he said gently. "We will keep you safe. I swear it on my life." She studied his face for a long moment, as though measuring the weight of his promise. Then she nodded solemnly and turned to look at me. "Miss Ashcroft saved me," she said. "She was brave." I smiled through my own tears. "We were brave together, Clara. And now we must be brave a little longer. There is still work to be done." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Ashworth's confession implicated Cornelius Blackwood in Eleanor's murder and the conspiracy to defraud the Duke of his rightful property. Warrants were issued, arrests were made, and the full scope of the scheme was laid bare before the courts. Marcus Whitmore, we learned, had not been killed. He had fled when he realized the danger his discovery had placed him in, disappearing into anonymity to protect himself. When word of the arrests reached him, he emerged from hiding and provided testimony that confirmed everything we had suspected. The oil beneath the marsh was real, and it was worth a fortune that would secure the future of Ravenmoor for generations to come. The sale was voided. The land returned to Edmund's control, and suddenly, the impoverished Duke of Ravenmoor was one of the wealthiest men in England. But wealth, I discovered, meant little to him compared to other things. It was a fortnight after Ashworth's arrest that Edmund asked me to walk with him in the garden. The storm had passed, and the world had emerged washed clean, the air crisp and cold and bright with winter sunshine. Clara was in the nursery with Mrs. Pemberton, practicing the words that came more easily to her now with each passing day. We walked in silence for a time, following the familiar paths between the dormant rose bushes and the bare-branched trees. I was acutely aware of his presence beside me, of the way his arm brushed against mine, of the questions that hung unspoken in the space between us. It was Edmund who finally broke the silence. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the future, about what comes next." "The oil will change everything," I replied. "You will be able to restore the estate, improve the lives of your tenants, secure Clara's inheritance. It is a remarkable opportunity." "Yes." He stopped walking and turned to face me. "But that is not what I have been thinking about." My heart began to race. Then what? He took a deep breath, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Vulnerability, uncertainty, hope. "I have been thinking about you, Rosalind. About what you have done for Clara, for Eleanor, for me. About the way you have transformed this house from a prison into something that feels almost like a home." He paused, as though gathering courage. "I have been thinking about how empty my life was before you came, and how unbearable it would be if you were to leave." I stared at him, hardly daring to breathe. "Edmund, I know what society would say." He pressed on before I could speak. "I know the whispers and the scandals that would follow. A duke does not marry a governess. It is not done. But I find I care very little for what is done. I care only for what is right. And what is right, Rosalind, is you, standing beside me, for all the days we have left." The tears came then, hot and fast, streaming down my cheeks despite my efforts to contain them. I had dreamed of this moment, had imagined it in the quiet hours of the night when hope seemed foolish and longing seemed futile. But I had never truly believed it could happen. "I am not your equal," I whispered. "I bring nothing to this union. No fortune, no connections, no family name worth speaking of. You bring everything that matters." He reached out and took my hands in his grip warm and steady. "You bring courage and kindness, and a heart so full of love it has room even for a cold, broken man who did not deserve your patience. You bring hope, Rosalind. You brought it to Clara, and you brought it to me, and I cannot imagine facing another day without it." I looked up at him, this man who had seemed so distant and untouchable when I first arrived, and I saw the truth written plainly on his face. He loved me, not despite the obstacles between us, but perhaps because of them. We had fought side by side, faced danger and darkness together, and emerged into the light changed in ways neither of us could have anticipated. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like a key turning in a lock, opening a door I had thought forever closed. "Yes, Edmund. Yes." He pulled me into his arms, and I felt the warmth of him surround me, solid and real and wonderfully, impossibly mine. We stood there in the winter garden, holding each other as the sun climbed higher in the sky, and I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The wedding was small, held in the chapel at Ravenmoor on a bright December morning. Clara served as my attendant, her autumn curls crowned with white ribbons, her gray eyes shining with a joy I had once feared she would never know. Mrs. Pemberton wept openly, abandoning for once her careful neutrality, and even the footman smiled as Edmund slipped the ring onto my finger. I, Rosalind Ashcroft, became the Duchess of Ravenmoor. The words still felt strange on my tongue, even months later, but the love behind them was as real and solid as the stone walls of the house I now called home. Spring came early that year, and with it a flurry of changes. The excavation of the marsh began under careful supervision, bringing wealth to the estate and employment to the village. The tenant cottages were repaired, the farms improved, and the shadow that had hung over Ravenmoor for so long began at last to lift. Clara flourished, She spoke more freely now, her words tumbling out in the eager rush of a child making up for lost time. She called me mother, a title I had never expected to hold, and the sound of it never failed to bring tears to my eyes. Eleanor's locket, which I had kept safe through all the trials of that terrible autumn, now hung around Clara's neck, where it belonged. But she had given me something in return, a drawing of our new family, standing together before the great house, our faces turned toward the sun. I hung it in our bedroom, where I could see it every morning when I woke. On the first anniversary of my arrival at Ravenmoor, Edmund took me to the edge of the marsh. The mist had lifted, and the landscape that had once seemed so desolate now hummed with activity. Workers moved across the terrain, machinery churned, and the black gold that had been hidden for so long was finally being brought to light. "Do you remember," he asked, "what you said to me the night I first told you about Clara? You said she was not broken, that she was merely waiting." "I remember." He turned to me, and in his eyes I saw the man he had become. Still proud, still reserved, but no longer cold, no longer alone. "I think I was waiting too," he said, "waiting for someone to show me that it was safe to feel again. Waiting for you, Rosalind." I took his hand and held it tightly. The road that had brought me here had been long and painful, marked by loss and loneliness and moments of despair. But standing there at the edge of the marsh, with the man I loved beside me and the child I cherished waiting for us at home, I understood at last what my father had tried to teach me all those years ago. Our worth is not measured in titles or fortune. It is measured in the love we give and the lives we touch. And by that measure, I was the richest woman in all of England. The sun was setting over Ravenmoor as we walked back to the house, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Clara ran out to meet us, her laughter ringing across the garden, and Edmund swept her up in his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. I watched them together, my husband and my daughter, and I felt my heart swell with a happiness so profound it bordered on pain. I had come to Ravenmoor with nothing, a single trunk, a broken heart, and a desperate need for employment. I had found something far more precious than I ever imagined. I had found home.